All right, welcome everyone. As I previously mentioned, this week we're going to dedicate into web development. We're going to be talking about HTML and CSS, which is essentially the user interface, everything that we interact with on the web. We will then talk about how to create a server, which is what our user interface interacts to actually make things happen, save information, make connections between one object and another object. And then finally, we'll talk about relational database management systems, which is where we'll be storing our data and where all the data will persist for every type of website. We'll go more in depth and in detail into each one of these topics later on inside of the cohort. Know that this week is specifically just an introductory week, right? None of this is meant to be far in depth to get you all the knowledge that you need to be proficient at all of these topics. We have a whole week dedicated for just UI, which is going to be our front end week. We have a whole week dedicated for our backend server. And I think we have about 3 days dedicated for relational database management systems. So please know this is introductory. If any of you have prior experience with web development and you have some additional questions that you want to ask, feel free to ask them, but know that if they are outside of the scope of the lecture, I will defer them for a later time. All right. With that said, in this first portion of our lecture, we're going to be going over HTML. We'll be covering what is HTML. I usually like to demonstrate Amazon.com alongside with that so that we can talk about the concept of boxes inside of boxes. Then we're going to go over the document structure, what exactly it is that builds an HTML text element. Then we're going to talk about HTML elements and tags, forms, anchors, lists, images, tables, and then finally we'll go over some common practices and semantics. At this point, does anyone have any questions over what we'll be covering during this first portion of the lecture? All right, it doesn't seem like there are any questions, so let's go ahead and kick this off. So what is HTML? Someone in this class must know. Can someone please tell me what is HTML?
I was gonna raise my hand, but I don't see it. It's the hypertext markup language. So just the words on the paper, essentially.
Awesome. So we got hypertext markup language. And just like you said, it's essentially just writing words and then letting the web turn those words or that series of characters into actual elements. Now, the hypertext language, what it used to look like before or when the internet first started, it was quite literally just text upon text with links to other text documents. And the whole reason why HTML was created or the web was created was because universities were trying to figure out a way to be able to share knowledge, share scientific research, and talk to one another. All right, so someone came up with, hey, well, we can do this with HTML. We can host it on one specific place. And then from there, we can have links to different resources or different research papers. And that's how it all started. Now, let's talk about a little bit of modern web development. Well, now if we take a look at Amazon.com, modern web development is a little bit more than just lines of text and paragraphs and research papers, right? Now we have carousels, which are dynamic elements that we can click on a button to make a specific image shift from one to another. We can see there's a little bit of decoration as well to have the animation happen between switching. And then notice this background fading as well, right? So someone is actively fading that background in as well. We have these boxes with links. If I click on something, it throws me straight into that specific product, excuse me. Here on the right-hand side, we can see that it's pulling all kinds of different information as to whether it matches a Kindle. It's showing me, hey, this does have a limited deal, right? All this information must be stored somewhere. There's no way that all of this exists just inside of an HTML template, but we'll talk about that later on. Now, although this is all very impressive and it looks super dynamic, well, what does it look like in actual code, all right? If we go into inspecting our element here, we'll see that all of our code is just an HTML document, all right? We have an HTML document, which then breaks down a body class here. We can see that it starts highlighting the body on my browser, all right? And there we have a div called a page. Apparently somebody ran out of ID names to give their stuff. And we see a lot of script tags here. We'll be talking about what script tags actually do later on. Let me scroll. Here we go. And here we get to our carousel that they have here on Amazon. All right. So finally we get to the one box that holds our carousel. Inside of it, there's another box that holds a deeper class, and more than likely they have these nested within one another because they have some CSS that they have to apply. And we can see they have some inline CSS here, talking about style, set size, minimum gutter width, a lot of different elements that go into that division. And if we continue to open up each division, eventually we'll get to the carousel. So here it is, carousel row inner. So before the click, and then we'll see the after the click actions if there were any. Oh boy. All right, and here is all the items of the carousel finally displaying. All right. So we can see that if I were to switch places here, there it shows me my carousel as well. Okay, great. So what in reality, what does this look like in reality? All right, well, all we have is one massive box called the HTML document. Inside of that HTML document, we have a header, right, which is all of this stuff up here. It looks like that header contains a small nav bar that crosses the bottom. It has a search bar up the top, and it has an Amazon logo on the right-hand side. Then we have our carousel. And then finally, we have these different divisions of 4 items. And let me actually make it more this way, where each division holds 3 separate items. And Len, I saw your hand up. Before I continue, do you want to throw in what you were about to say?
Well, you started drawing, and I wasn't gonna. You kind of did what I was gonna do, but I'll say it anyways here, which is if you got lost with all the clicks and the going down there, literally every click, as Francisco always says, is boxes within boxes. So every click is you're diving inside of a box of more boxes, and so really holding that idea as you see him whip around here, and not being so stressed out about what the box is or exactly what the tag is right now, but just understand that he's diving into boxes, and now he's dissecting the box.
All right, awesome. So as we were mentioning before, and just like Glenn reiterated, everything is just boxes inside of boxes, right? We see that our carousel is just its independent box. It's actually likely nested inside of another massive box that they probably call the body, which we'll go into here shortly. And then we have our carousel, and then a series of multiple rows demonstrating different items that you can purchase. All right. And that's all Amazon.com really breaks down to, right? We'll talk about all the other dynamics that are here. What actually happens when I click this arrow, like what generates all these images, where does all this information come from? Later on when we start talking about APIs and how to interact with APIs. All right, at this point, does anyone have any questions over any of the material that I just covered or the concept of boxes inside of boxes?
Sorry, could you please explain what the dotted line is again?
Yes, so this dotted line, I have it as supposed to represent the carousel. The reason why I have it as a dotted line is, and I apologize, I kind of just did it instinctively. It falls in the background, but it's not actually part of the background, and it doesn't follow the regular CSS layout. So this has a specific layout that only applies to it, even though it's a division that is part of the body. Its CSS is unique in a way that doesn't apply to the remaining of the rows. So I put it as a dotted line to emphasize in my brain, like, hey, this is unique and it falls in the background. And notice that I have it overlapping. That's because of the blend, right? I see the blend happening here, which tells me that the picture doesn't actually stop up here. The picture that is being demonstrated stops all the way down here. And that's why I have it down there. Does that answer your question, Sean?
Yes, thank you.
All right, great. Well, now that we've taken a look at that, let's go into how we could actually build an HTML document. You'll notice that I have two different files here. I have index.html and I have main.css. Index.html is likely going to be your standard for the majority of projects, unless you have something very specific that you're working on as to why you wouldn't name it index.html. But this is going to be your go-to naming convention. Now, when it comes to building your HTML template, there's a couple of tags that are required. Let me actually bring them up here. So we'll talk about each one of these one-on-one. The keyboard shortcut that I used is just an exclamation mark, and then you press tab, and it'll fill out your HTML document for you. All right. So here's the first tag, doctype space HTML. Interesting. Now, we as developers, we know this is an HTML document because of the fact that it's a .html, right? It ends with .html. And VS Code even takes it a step further and gives us a little icon to say, hey, this is supposed to hold HTML documents. But how does the browser know that this is supposed to be an HTML document? Well, that's what line 1 does, right? As our code gets executed, or as we go into a website, let's say Amazon.com, and I click on refresh, what happens is a request gets sent out to a server somewhere, right? My browser is saying, hey, I need something to render at this address. I don't know what it is that I'm supposed to show. So it goes into the internet, utilizes the internet protocol, and it finds the correct location and says, hey, this is the server that I'm supposed to be speaking to. What do you want me to show the user? So then the server goes into its system and it finds index.html and then shoots it back and says, this is what I want you to show the user. But this is just text, right? That's all it really breaks down to. It's just text. So when it comes back to the browser, Google.com or Google Chrome, it knows that this is supposed to be interpreted as HTML because of this very first line, right? This tells the browser, hey, this is a document of type HTML, and you should read it as such, right? If you remove the tag, it could cause some really big misbehavior. Some browsers may not be able to interpret this as HTML if they don't have some sort of default setting for it. So just always ensure that you include this tag of doctype HTML. All right, so now the HTML language. This is essentially just saying all of the language that we will find inside of this HTML will be in English. So if at any point some of these aren't written in English, it may throw some sort of error for us, or it may not an error, excuse me. It may highlight it as showing as a misspelling, but it's not that dynamic of a feature, so don't expect it to do a lot of spelling checking for you. If you want something for spelling checking, I'm actually terrible at spelling. So I have an extension here called Code Spell. Every time I mess something up, it highlights it in blue and tells me, hey, you don't know how to spell. So it's really helpful. It doesn't give you suggestions as to how to spell it correctly, which is the only thing that I wish it did. But it at least forces me to become a better speller. All right, now we go into head. Now this head portion is something that we don't actually see on the browser in itself. It's something that's kind of invisible. The only part of head that we do see is title. In this case, the title will be demonstrated on the tab up above. So for this HTML template, the title says Amazon.com, spend less, and something else in there. But that's supposed to be the title that shows up on the tab. Now, this meta for char set UTF just talks about the character set that will be utilized inside of this document. UTF-8 is the standard, and it's been the standard for a while. I can't remember off the top of my head how many years it's been the standard, but it's just the standard keyboard that we see nowadays for characters. Now, this meta name for viewport, this part is actually really important. This part takes the content or the scale of your entire monitor or how much the browser is utilizing, and it regulates the scale of the HTML content that's being displayed. So for example, if I have an image that's being displayed, let's say this image here, right? of the Vikings versus the Rams. Well, if this image was being displayed, but this tag was missing, this image wouldn't necessarily follow the left and right borders. It would just occupy the default amount of pixels that it comes with instead of falling in between that left and right border. So this viewport will scale everything to the browser. All right. So out of these, what are essential tags? The doc type HTML is an essential tag. The head is an essential tag. This meta viewport is an essential tag. And this title is an essential tag. We haven't talked about body just yet, but body is everything that actually gets rendered into this site. So let's talk about this from the browser perspective again. It receives this text document. It says, well, what kind of document is this? It's an HTML document. Great. What language will I be displaying? English. Fantastic. Now, head essentially means before you do anything with the body or before you start rendering anything in the body, make sure that you do this ahead of time. So in the head, it determines, all right, the character set I will be utilizing will be UTF-8. And the viewport is a 1-to-1 scale in relation to the browser. And then finally, here is the title for my tab. And then it starts rendering things through the body. So let's just quickly show something in the body. Let's say, hello, Yankee. And now we're going to go ahead and take this live. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this file. And after I click on this file, I can either click on go live on my lower right-hand corner if you have the live extension already installed, or you could right click and you can see that it gives me the option of open with live server. Both of these options do exactly the same thing, but you'll see that it opens an HTML document, right? Or it opens a new site. If we take a look at where it's being opened at 127.0.0.1. For those of you who don't know, this essentially is just saying inside of this machine, in port 50211, so my local machine, my computer, has a ridiculous amount of ports that are available for me to do development or different functionalities in. And in this case, live server just occupies one of those that isn't being utilized. So once it opens it, oh, hello. That's not what I meant to do. Let me go ahead and open that up again. Oh, I'm just going to kill it and reopen it. All right, so once it opens up, it says what I'm rendering here on the screen is index HTML. Great, and that's how we get hello Yankee. So it grabs index HTML. The browser looks, says there's an HTML document. Here's the language we'll be displaying, character set, the ratio of 1-to-1 for sizing, and then we have our title tab. So for example, if I wanted to do Yankee in here, you'll see that live server updates, and now my tab says Yankee instead of document. And hello Yankee, well, that I could change it as well to hello all or hello world. Once autosave gets triggered, then it gets updated through live server. And that's the very basics of how the communication between the browser and the HTML document element happens. At this point, does anyone have any questions over these essential tags or how I went into building my initial HTML template? All right, doesn't seem like there are any questions. So let's start talking about body. Now, inside of the body is where all of your code will actually exist, where everything that the user is going to see. And with that said, we have a couple of different elements that we can utilize. There's such a thing as an H1 tag, and let's do hello. Let me try to quickly do this real quick here. faster if I do it this way. All right, so there we can see our different header tags. Now, header tags are usually specifically used to represent something important or the header of something. Sometimes people will utilize CSS or specific styling to change how the header tag is being demonstrated, or maybe they can make their own specific class that they would like to utilize for a header. But these are the default that are provided within the HTML language. You'll notice that H1 is the biggest, and as you go down, it becomes small, right? So from H1 to H6, and in case you want to see a different example of that, well, if you go into your readmes, 1 hash means it's an H1, and 2 hashes means it's an H2. So if you view this, we get the biggest element at the top, and H2 being a little bit smaller than what the H1 is. So that's our header tags. Now we also have something like p tags. And p tags are just utilized for text. Now notice that the text isn't necessarily wrapped in a specific way. It's just falling from left to right. All right, and as I close the division, it's squeezing all that text to ensure that it fits. Right, but there is nothing separating if I press enter 3 times. Even after it saves, you'll see that nothing changed inside of my text here. All this white space, the HTML doesn't care about white space. It doesn't know how to recognize it, so it just defaults it into the next character. Right, so white space doesn't matter. If you decide to put white space in between tags, that's purely a design-based decision for yourself. HTML itself is not going to recognize that. Now, what you can do to show a little bit of spacing is show a line break. And a line break is as follows. So there is a line break, right? The first line break comes out of Fisher, and then I have an extra line break just so that we have a blank space between them. If I were to comment out one of them, you'll see that there's no blank space. It's just a line break out of Fisher. But because there's 2 of them, it gives me kind of like an indent, not an indent. It gives me an extra blank space in between the lines. All right, and that is our regular text tags. There's quite a bit more that we'll go into here shortly, but before I move on, does anyone have questions regarding the H1 tag, the paragraph tag, or the line break tag? All right, actually something important to point out here regarding the line break tag, notice that it is a self-closing tag, while the other ones were not, right? They all opened and then close with this backslash. That's how we close the tag. Same thing with paragraph. Paragraph opens, and then we close the tag with that slash at the bottom. Well, line break is a self-closing tag, and we'll see a couple of other self-closing tags as we go on forward. But you'll notice that we open the tag and close it at the same time. I don't need both of these in order to have a line break. The line breaks still exist, so they're not dependent on one another. They open and close within one line. All right, now let's move on into different tags here that we can apply. So we have our division element. And a division is just a simple way of putting everything inside of a box. Get rid of all of these here. All right, so there we have one division that says hello. And let me actually put another parent division here. So you'll see that now I have 3 separate divisions, right? And let's go ahead and take a look here. So if I go into my elements or into inspecting my elements, you'll see here on the lower left-hand side, I have this division. Right? That's the parent of all these other mini divisions. Inside, I have 1 div, 2 divs, and 3 divisions, all of them with the same content of an H1 element and a paragraph element. But that division just put a box around them. So we have the body, 1 division, and then inside of it, we have a nested division with an H1 element and a paragraph tag. And we see that happening 3 separate times. All right. That's all we've built up to this point. All right, so division tags are specifically for grouping. We'll see why that's important here in a bit. All right, there you go. Finally, everything got commented out. All right, let's make a short version here. So I'm going to have a division tag with an H1 tag and a paragraph tag. Let's do some quick lorem ipsum there. Oh, did that wrong. This H1 tag will say hello Yankee. There you go. So now we're back at it again. We have 1 division with an H1 tag and 1 paragraph tag. Okay, fantastic. So divisions are essentially just to group one massive or a group of elements, right? We're grouping them all into one so that we can apply CSS or maybe some other content. We'll see that more in practice once we go into the second portion of our lecture. Now there's the span tag. Now the span tag can be utilized to isolate either multiple number of characters or just 1 character at a time. So for example, let's say we wanted this ipsum to be 1 specific character at a time. Or we can say I, and then knock span again. And so on. I'm not going to do the whole thing because that would take a pretty considerable amount of time. But we can see how the span tag can be utilized for 1 specific letter and still gets bunched up as if it were 1 word without adding any spaces into it. Well, why does that become useful? Let's say we wanted to decorate something that was in an arch shape, right? We wanted like an arch set of characters. Well, we would need a way to have each individual letter have its own rotation and its own positioning. So the most common way that I see the span tag being utilized is developers will use it to grab each one of these letters and change their position, whether it's up or down by just a bit. And then rotating them in order to create this fanning exercise. Right, so that's the way that I see it mostly utilized. Span will isolate each one of these characters, and then people will attach some sort of CSS or JavaScript to actually make them rotate. So that's where the span tag comes in handy. Now, the next one we have is strong. If I go back into our example, we'll see hello being bolded. That is the strong element. It makes something bold. We also have emphasize. Which makes something italic. We have the U element, which underlines information. And then we have the anchor element, which we'll talk about later on once we go into anchor tags. But these are the different type of text decorators. We have the span tag, which can be utilized to isolate specific characters. We have the strong tag, which makes characters bold. We have the emphasize tag, which makes characters italicize. And we have the U tag, which underlines a specific number of texts. All right. At this point, does anyone have any questions regarding those different element tags for text?
Real quick, you did the div greater than symbol, h1 greater than, and then p greater than, and that rendered all three of those for you with the opening and closing tags. Do you have to get an extension, or does that come with VS Code?
Got it. So that is a VS Code shortcut, and all it is you write the element that you want to have, and then you specify what element you want inside of it. So for this example, I want an H1 tag, and I think you could do something like this, and a P tag, and then, oh no, I didn't like that. So you can have a div, another div, you could even add a multiplier. So let's say that inside of each div, I wanted 3 P tags, and inside of each one of these P tags, I wanted 6 H2 tags. Then it populates it for me. So there's all the divisions with their H2 tags and P tags as I multiplied it. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Of course, no problem. Let me delete that since we won't be utilizing that. All right, great. So that is all the HTML elements that we'll be talking about for this portion. Let's go ahead and start talking about some forms and inputs. How does this work? Well, again, I'm going to have it nested within a division, and then I'm going to open up something called a form. Now, a form takes different types of fields. We have an input field, which we can do of many types. In this case, let's just stick with our regular type text, and then we'll go over the rest later on. We could also have text area. We can have something like this select. Here. Okay, so we have input, select, and I think there's one more here that I could have. I guess we could just do the classical button of submit. All right. Oh. Okay. So let's talk about these different input fields here. So we have our regular type text, which you can just type text into, but it has a maximum amount of characters. I think it's 250, I'm not sure off the top of my head, but I do know that it has a restriction of the amount of characters you can type in. Well, we have a text area in case you want someone to be able to type in, let's say, review, and they have to be able to do indentation and make paragraphs, this is where the text area would come in handy, opposite to a type of input field. We then have our select option. Our select option is basically a drop-down menu, and I can select between the three options of X-ray, Yankee, or none. You'll notice that if I refresh the page, none is the first one that displays, and that is because I added the default keyword into this option, right? And that's why we have none. This value type that is interpreted by the form once it gets inputted or sent, which we'll see here shortly. And actually, I'm gonna add a name convention here. Nope, they wouldn't go there. Here. I'm gonna add a name convention here so we can see it once we submit the form here shortly. I'm gonna add a name here. Let's put a placeholder saying type your. All right, so you'll see placeholder gives me a little bit of a hint as to what is supposed to go there. Here we can put some sort of review. Here I can select what cohort I'm doing, and then when I click submit, my form will actually submit into the browser. Well, let's put this form into practice and let's see what happens here. I'm gonna go ahead and put Francisco, none. Let's say that I'm in X-ray, and I'm gonna submit my form. Well, my form just went blank. Well, let's take a look at the URL up here. Notice that the URL or the browser actually received this information. When I placed submit, what it did is they sent a post request or a sent information over to the browser. Now, how does it know how to interpret this information? Well, you'll notice that I gave this input field an argument of name or an attribute of name. So here we can see that it grabbed the attribute of name and it set the value to what I placed inside of the input field, Francisco. Well, the same thing happens down below in the select form, right? The select, I gave it the name of cohort. Here we can see cohort, and it has the value of X-ray, right? So after the question mark is where all my arguments or parameters are being passed in. And each one of these parameters are being separated by this, I think it's called an ampersand. I'm going to go with ampersand, by this ampersand to separate all of the values. All right, so that's how the forms are actually working. They're sending information over to the browser. The browser is then capturing it and saving it within and making it accessible within the URL. We'll learn how to work with these values and how to work with forms in more detail later on once we start implementing JavaScript into our index HTML. But for now, this is where we're going to stop our knowledge with forms. All right. Let's see. Before I move on, I do want to make sure that we show the other types of inputs here. So I'm going to go ahead and show that. Say input, and we could have something like color that will actually let you choose from a color palette, right? So maybe you want to capture someone's favorite color. You'll notice that this is also a self-closing tag. I forgot to mention that earlier. You could also have date, and that will allow you to choose a date, populates a calendar for you. There's checkbox, which is just somebody checking a box. I think there's also radio. Yeah, there is radio, which again is just someone checking a box. It's just you can't unclick it. All right. So there's a lot of different input fields that you could utilize. We could spend a pretty good amount here just talking about input fields. But if you just search up on the web different types of input fields, or there's something specific that you want to capture, if you look it up, it's going to give you the best suggestion for a form of input field that you can utilize to capture the user data. All right. Now let's talk about anchors. Well, actually, before I move out of forms, does anyone have any questions regarding forms, the select, text area, or input fields? Okay, awesome. Let's go into talking about some anchor tags here. So an anchor tag is a way of linking to another site or another template within your own site. Here, anchor tags do a hard redirect, meaning that once this gets processed by the browser is essentially re-rendering your entire site. It's an entire new set of communication between the client and the server. So let's say in this case, I want there to be a tag that takes me to Amazon. Notice that it's not highlighted in blue yet. It's just interpreted as text. And that's because it's missing the href attribute. Where if I put Amazon.com, well, now it's highlighted in blue. And when I click on it, it doesn't know how to interpret this. And that's because I've got the https://Amazon.com. Let's try that again. Ugh. There you go. So now it takes me to Amazon.com. I just had to utilize the HTTPS for Hypertext Transfer Protocol Secure to Amazon.com. All right, so that's how I could go from my site to another site. And if I wanted to have a separate template within my site that gets linked here, let's say I have this site here. And inside of this site, I just have H1. Well, I can have an anchor tag with an href of profile/HTML. I can make it go to profile. So now when I click on profile, it just shows me that profile template that I had next to it, where it's just an empty HTML document with the H1 of profile. So that's how you could link to outside sources, or you can link to other templates within your own project. All right, and that is the anchor tag in a nutshell. Does anyone have any questions regarding the anchor tag? Okay, great. Let's go into some lists. Let me comment this whole thing out here. All right, so lists. There is two different types of lists. We could either have order lists, which are explicit by OL, and then we have list items within order list, which again are explicit by LI for list items. So let's say I wanted an order list of 3 items. Well, we can see we have 1, 2, and 3. Right? And it just creates a numbered list of 1, 2, and 3. Now we can also have an unordered list of 3 items. And when I do this, we can see that an unordered list is just bullet points where they are not numbered and it's showing the list. Now I could have nested lists as well. Let's go ahead and add an order list here. So there we can see the unordered list being nested. Doesn't nest very pretty, but it does nest. Let's see if we have another UL element here. There you go. So if you utilize another UL element, it'll be able to indent it and make it a little bit prettier for you. But if you start mixing the order list and unordered, it starts kind of freaking out and not knowing how to format it properly. So just make sure you keep that in mind whenever you're working with lists and trying to have nested lists within one another. All right, any questions regarding lists? I have not been checking Slack, so let me make sure I check Slack as well. Okay, luckily there are no questions on Yankee questions, so let's go ahead and keep moving forward here. We talked about our list. We have talked about almost all the HTML there is to talk about, but let's go ahead and talk about images. And while I wait for images, if someone can please provide me a good image that I can show here. If it's something funny, that's okay. Just make sure it's appropriate since it will be recorded. So just an opportunity for the class to send me something. I'll be waiting on the Zoom chat. Okay, no one wants to send me a picture. Cool. I'll grab something. Oh, broken. I think I finally got something from someone. Let's see. Nope. I did not. I apologize, everyone. Is my fire alarm really that loud? I gotta get that fixed. All right, so there we go. We have our image element there. Our image element has two tags, a source tag and an alt tag. We won't go into alt tags today, but here we can provide the source as to where this image lives. When we provide a URL, it then goes into rendering it on the screen. But in this case, we're having a little bit of an issue due to size. So let me go ahead and I apologize, everyone. Please skip this part if you do not feel comfortable, but I'm just going to add a little bit of height here.
So that part's gonna be covered in CSS, right, Francisco? What you're doing right now, you're just kind of like massaging it due to time frame.
Exactly. Yes. Yes, I will be covering this style part here shortly. All right, but now we can see we have our something showing up for our image tag. All right. So now the next thing to go over is going to be tables. Ooh, I haven't done a table in a while. Let's see how this goes. All right, so we should have a table header. Table head, there you go. And then there's table rows. And inside of each table row, there is a table data.
So I haven't done tables in a while, and I'll let you keep typing here, Francisco, but I'll add the thing here that some of the CSS functionality has kind of, I don't want to say deprecated because tables still very much able to be used, but made it less of a standard to grab, right? That's how I think about it. The HTML tag for table.
That's correct. Especially with Bootstrap and everything going around now.
Right. Yeah, I was thinking mostly like Flex and just some of the CSS. We're covering CSS, but the way CSS does, it's added functionality that we used to do with HTML that is no longer in vogue, but still possible, right? It's never, it isn't, I wouldn't call it deprecated.
Table row.
Just trying to get interesting facts while you're getting it set up. Because table is one of those things where you scratch your head nowadays because you just use it so infrequently.
I concur. Yeah. Let me see. One.
I think more common while he's setting this up is to see lists used and list views in combination with CSS to make this kind of a setup he's doing right now blazingly fast. And we'll see that in a little bit.
There you go. All right, we got it, everybody. I apologize. But now we can see we have this table here with each row having a header of 1, 2, and 3, and then each row having data inside of it. It's a little bit of semantics here. And honestly, remembering the syntax is probably the hard part, especially with this table header. Doesn't seem to be falling inside of our table the way we want it to, but it's there. But here we have the table body and each one of our table rows being displayed here for our table. Just like Glenn said, we're going to be going over how to do this with Flexbox later on and bumping around with divisions. But this is just something that comes with HTML. Not necessarily deprecated, just not really used much nowadays. And that is it for tables, everyone. Does anyone have any questions regarding tables? Oh, that was a good one, Demi. All right, I'm starting to lose the class because this is a considerable amount of content. I get it, everyone. I'm sure everybody has had some work with HTML before. So let's quickly go over our semantics and end our lecture, our first part lecture here. So the next part that we're going to be talking about is going to be our semantics here. So inside of the body, we could have a header. We also have main, and we also have a footer. Now, all of these, when being interpreted by the browser, they're just divisions. They're another way of grouping. Inside of my header, you will typically find a nav. And this nav bar is usually a list of LI items that will be displayed from left to right, which we'll see later on. Let's make this. All right, so all of these would have links. Then we would have the header will carry pretty much everything that we see from the edge of this image going up. That is all our header. Main would be all of this information that we see in the actual center. That would be main. That's where all the good stuff of our website would actually fall. So in here, we may have multiple divisions. Times 2 with multiple paragraph tags. All right, so that might be something that we see inside of our main. And then we have these things called section, article, and aside. So aside and article, they're just supposed to represent, so aside is supposed to represent something that is to support an article or related to some sort of content. Article is quite literally just an article format showing, hey, all the information in here is an article. And those tags are very much just like so. So we have article, which carries a bunch of lorem ipsum, and then we have aside, which will also carry a bunch of lorem ipsum. Let's take a look here. So you see there's no text difference as to how it's being demonstrated or how everything is being organized. So why do these tags exist, right? Like, why utilize these tags if they're not actually changing anything on my HTML document? Can anybody take a guess?
To help with readability of the code.
Exactly, right. It's quite literally just to allow other developers to take a look at code and easily identify, hey, this is supposed to be an article, and this is everything that falls for that article. This is an aside. It doesn't look like an aside. The CSS isn't actually demonstrating that. Let's fix some of the CSS here to ensure that it works properly. And that's it. All right, this is all just for readability. These are not essential tags, but the ones that I will say are expected of you to maintain will be header, main, and footer. All right, moving forward, whenever you work on any sort of project, make sure that you have your header, main, and footer separated. Otherwise, other developers may look at your HTML code and disregard it because of the fact that it doesn't have just a very basic semantics inside of it. All right, at this point, we have covered what is HTML. We quickly overview Amazon.com. We went over the document structure for HTML. We covered elements, tags, forms, inputs, anchors, lists, images, tables, and different HTML semantics. At this point, does anyone have any questions over anything that we covered over the first part of our lecture? All right, it doesn't seem like there are any questions. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording now. All right, welcome everyone. In this portion of our lecture, we're gonna be going over CSS. We're gonna go over inline style, how to work with the style tag inside of an HTML document. We'll then talk about the hierarchy of IDs, classes, and tags. We'll talk about links. And finally, we'll go into the CSS box model. All right, let's get this started. Let me comment out this whole shabam bam that we have here so that it doesn't get in our way. And I think the easiest way we could do styling is by making some boxes inside of boxes. All right. So currently we have these division classes. There's 3 rows, and each one of these rows should have 1 box. Let's put some numbers to them so that we can see them. All right, so there you go. There's our 3 rows with 3 boxes inside of them. And we're gonna go over how to decorate these real quick. All we're gonna do is we're gonna go ahead and create a quick spectrum of 3 boxes, all 3 by 3. Maybe we'll throw in some colors in there. We'll see how we could do this. Well, let's start off by decorating just one individual box. All right, let's say that I want to add some style to this box here. What I can do is add the word style next to the division element. And by adding this attribute, I can then add a specific height, which let's say I want my height to be 20 v min. And I can also add a width of 20 v min. Oh, excuse me. 20 there. All right, so there's my height. Oh, that's actually pretty big. Let's do 10. Cut it in half. There you go. All right, so there's my width and height. But I can't really see it other than the fact that there's a little bit of spacing here. So maybe there's a couple of other things I could do. Well, let's go ahead and break this style tag down a little bit. All right. So additionally, I'm also going to add maybe a background color. And let's go ahead and make this one yellow. And I could even add a border that will say, hey, this is 1 pixel. The border will be black. And I want it to be solid. There you go. There's my little box. All right. I've added some inline style. This is called inline style, where I'm essentially adding a tag to each one, or styling to each one of these division elements, or this division in this case. All right. But like we said before, we wanted it to apply to every single one of these. All right. So I wonder how I could write some repetitive code, kind of like an OOP, right? We utilize this concept of inheritance to write code that will then be reused in different places. Well, what I'm going to do is inside of my script tag, I'm going to go ahead, or excuse me, inside of my head, I'm going to go ahead and create a script tag. Oh, and I apologize. It is not a script tag. It is a style tag. And in this style tag, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a class. Now, we haven't gone over how to apply these classes yet, so let's not freak out. Let's just quickly go over what we want this class to do, right? What I want this class to do is I want it to apply these attributes, or these style attributes, to anybody holding this class of box. Well, how could I apply that then? Well, currently, what I can do is I can say, hey, instead of class, I want you to apply to all division elements. And we can see that all of my division elements all of a sudden get this class, right? So there's one way of applying style repetitively by just putting div. I am applying all of these styles to all existences of the div tag. That's not doing what I want it to do though. You can see that some of my boxes are squeezed together and it's not formatted properly. So since I don't want it to apply to all divs, I want to create a class named box. Now for these classes named box, all I need to do is I need to find all of my div attributes and then simply add the class of box. Now you can see numbers 1, 2, and 3 have this. Let's go ahead and add it to the remaining of them. And now you can see that I have all of my boxes being laid out for me, right? Okay, great. Maybe there's something else I want to do to these boxes. Maybe I want a little bit of color iteration. Let's say that this class is just box red. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to change the background color to red. Well, how do I apply that? Let's say that for each one of the second elements, or actually let's mix it up. I want to apply a secondary class. All I need to do is type in box red. So now the first class is being applied. That's what creates our, our width and height, and also gives us a border of black. Now the background color of yellow is also being executed, but you can see that I have the secondary class of box red. Well, what CSS does, CSS stands for cascading style sheets, meaning that it cascades. It goes from top to bottom. Whatever bottom styling you have will trump the styling that came before it, as long as they're at the same style level. So the tag element is the lowest level. The class element is the second level. So because these are both on the same style level, when I pass in background color red, the ones that have box dash red get the background color of red. It's a little bit of inheritance, right? Just like we saw in OOP, where inheriting the box class, and there's one specific attribute within the box class that we want to change, and that happens inside of box red. All right, so there's classes and inline styles. Before I move on to IDs, does anyone have any questions over classes and inline styles? All right, doesn't seem like there are any questions, so let's go ahead and put these all in one specific row. I'm gonna add the class of row. And all I'm going to do to this class is I'm going to change it to display flex. There you go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Right, display flex just simply collapses everything so that everything is from left to right rather than from top to bottom. It's just a flex direction kind of thing. We'll go over flex more in detail later on once we go into our responsive web design lecture. But for now, this is where our flex knowledge is going to stop. All right. So there you go. I have my box of boxes, each one of them being implemented. But what if I wanted a container that holds this entire box, right? Maybe I want to add one additional division. And this division will be the container. Well, now this container is one specific division, and it's only going to apply to one thing. Now, because this styling will only apply to one thing, I will make this an ID named container. And now for the container, since it's an ID, you would symbolize this using the £, adding container, and then simply adding your CSS. So let's say we want some padding here. Let's go with 5v min, and let's do a border. Solid. 1v min. Oh, hello. And let's make it purple. Okay, finally, I'm gonna display flex. Justify content center. Align items center. And I think that should do it. Oh. There you go. All right, so now I've added a little bit of padding. You can see my container in this purple border, and I have centered all of my rows and checkered boxes. All right. All of this will only apply through the container class. Now, a container is still a division, so I wonder, let's try to overwrite some of this information. I'm going to add a division, and I'm going to make this the background color of, let's do black. Well, now the only one that got the background color black was my container. Why is that?
Is it because that's the last thing that you've stated, or because it's cascading, or I'm not exactly sure. I'm just guessing.
Yeah, that was a pretty good guess. So it's not necessarily that it's the last one or the order. It's more the fact that it's the only one that didn't have a background color. So because it didn't have a background color, it was able to adopt the original one from the div class. But let's add a background color, right? Let's say that we wanted our background color to be gray. Well, now you can see that the container was able to trump the div class. All right. So in order of hierarchy, IDs will always take priority. Classes will come in second. And then the last styling that will ever be considered will be the element level tag. And this is how you write CSS for HTML inside of style tags. Does anyone have any questions regarding how to place your CSS inside of style tags, how element tags, classes, and IDs work? Any questions over anything that I've covered up to this point? All right, doesn't seem like there are any questions. There's definitely a lot of other things that you can do with CSS that you can add to this. Unfortunately, we're not going to go over them today. Then we're going to save them for our responsive web design class. But there is one other useful thing that I would like us to cover today. So this right here on the lower right-hand corner is called the CSS box model. And as I've mentioned multiple times, everything is just boxes inside of boxes. Now this really breaks it down for us. If I tackle down my body here and I go into the body, you can see that it shows me the container. And if I were to click on the container class, it even gives me, hey, this doesn't have any margins. Here's the location of your border. This is how much padding you're currently using. And this is the content inside of this element. So this is the size of the box that I am a parent of. Then I have all my rows. Or I can highlight one row. You can see that it shows me just the row itself. I can go into each box. It shows me the box content, and then it shows me the border. Now, why is this useful? Well, sometimes your CSS won't necessarily add up, or it won't do exactly what you want it to do. And you may be wondering, well, it doesn't make any sense. Why isn't it doing what I want it to do? Or why isn't this completely aligned? This is where the box model comes in handy. So for example, right now, you can see that my purple border is not touching the outside of my web page. That's not necessarily something I want. It doesn't look very pretty, right? If we go to Amazon.com, they don't have a blank line on the outside of their web page the entire time. So how do I fix that? Well, I would go into the object model, go all the way up to my container, and I can see that my container has a border, but it doesn't have a margin. Well, why is that happening? Maybe the element above is what has this margin. And if I click on the body, we can see that the body has a margin of 8. So in order to flush this, I would just say, hey, body margin 0. And that would flush it. All right, so margin is the space from one element to another. So let me draw it this way. So let's say we have, this. Outboard would be the margin. The width of the content itself, or excuse me, of this border itself, this is the border. The space between the border to content is the padding. All right, so border to content is padding, then we have border, and then we have margin. And that is the CSS box model. Does anyone have any questions regarding the CSS box model? Okay, doesn't seem like there are any questions. Let's go ahead and move on into our last topic of the day. The last topic of today is going to be more around the concept of isolating your code, right? You don't necessarily want your code to be mixed up all the time. Right now, we have my classes here, which is perfectly acceptable. Classes are HTML attributes, so this is where they belong. But all of the CSS that I've written, I don't necessarily want it inside of the same document. I mean, look at how big our document is, right? Just in CSS, if we were not to count all of these commented out stuff, would be already at 57 lines of code. And the majority of that would be from CSS. Not only that, but if I make a mistake in my CSS, I'm possibly going to break my entire HTML. I don't necessarily want that. I'd rather have something without styling than nothing at all. So how do I fix that, right? How do I ensure that these two documents or that this code exists, but that they exist separately so that if one of them is messed up, the other one still works? Well, that's where main CSS comes into play. And main CSS is just a place where we can dump all of our styling. So for example, if I were to take this entire style here and I cut it, and I put it here inside of main.css. Well, now all this styling can relate to index HTML. But how do I do that? Right? How does it know to connect to one another? Well, that's where the link tag comes in. The link tag can take a relationship of style sheet, and this is what's telling it, hey, I'm linking you to a style sheet. Then after that, it just needs to know where this style sheet lives. In this case, it lives inside of this same directory in main.css. And you can see all my CSS gets loaded up. So now when the browser receives this HTML document, it says, hey, this is an HTML document. We're going to be speaking in English. We're going to be utilizing the character set of UTF-8. We're going to have a 1-to-1 ratio when it comes to styling. The tab will say Yankee, and it does. We're going to link this style sheet. Oh, well, let's check if the style sheet exists. Okay, it does exist. Let's load all this CSS. So it loads all the CSS. It puts it into the program before it starts rendering anything. And once all the CSS is done rendering or being computed, then it starts rendering the HTML document so that it already applies the CSS and we don't get this weird glitch where we see our content without CSS and then it gets loaded. Well, it loads the CSS first so that as soon as the content is being populated, it already has the style being loaded as well. And that is it for linking your style sheet to index.html. Does anyone have any questions regarding linking or why we're isolating our code this way? Okay. In that case, in today's lecture, we've covered what is HTML. Amazon, we took a quick overview at Amazon.com. We went over document structure, elements, tags, forms, inputs, anchors, lists, images, tables, and different HTML semantics. We went over inline CSS, how to write CSS within style tags, the ID, class, and tag level hierarchy, how to link to a different CSS file, and the CSS box model. At this point, does anyone have any questions over any of the material that was taught today?
I had a question, Francisco.
Let's hear it.
So, I just asked in the group chat, like, so when is the use of divs too much? And like, how would you go about using divs efficiently? Because I feel like if we get too overzealous with the divs, it's going to be a div within a div within a div within a div with like 10 million divs. Like, is there like a good way in practice to use the divs, or is it just like that's just how it is?
Yeah, it's a great question. And unfortunately, the short answer is that's just how it is. You're eventually going to end up with a ridiculous amount of divisions inside of other divisions. And that's why class and IDs are so important, right? Because not only do they mark your styling, but you could also use it to describe, hey, this is what's inside of this box, or this is why we have this division here. So that when people read that specific class name, they're not just saying, oh, this is the styling that's in there. They can say, oh, this is the content that belongs in here, and group it to its appropriate location. Does that answer your question, Sam?
Yep. Thank you.
Let's hear it, Len.
Yeah, so I wanted to just point out too that like what Francisco's doing here is like kind of going back to like the 70s and 80s and how the internet was gone through, and like introducing some of the things, and then like CSS is like the 90s, and then as we go forward, like adding new technologies, and it will make the things you learned before easier to use, and therefore like the div becomes more popular, or didn't exist at one point at all. And so you know all this information because you've seen the web and you've done some things, but as we're going through here, starting at a point when some of the stuff didn't exist, and so it's hard to undo that spaghetti. So just keep that in mind as you go forward, and it does become a little clearer, and then it shows what the tools, because your question is a valid question, it shows what the tools that we're going to use at the end actually do for like the previous generation of tools, if that makes sense. Anyways.
Awesome. Thank you, Len. I appreciate it. All right. And definitely just make sure that I just want to make sure to recap. This is not as the furthest depth that we're going to go into the front end or CSS or any of it. Just know this is a quick introductory. We will be diving deeper later on. I know a lot of you probably went through FOP and you probably sat through this class and you're pretty bored, but it is going to be useful. I promise we'll see this evolve. All right, since there are no other questions, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.